You know I'm right. And we have another big guest here, Nick Durst and Joe Calabrese. And Joe, right here in the zone, we have our first guest coming back for the second time. We're really excited about it.
Yes, this is our first two-time guest. This is a really, really, really special episode. And since the first time we had him on, a lot has changed in the past couple of months. We have a lot of really great things we want to recap now that baseball season has ended and the offseason is about to begin. So without further ado, our first two-time guest, it is an honor and a privilege. Thank you for coming on. Mr. Tim Kirk, he's back. Tim, how are you? Happy belated Thanksgiving. How have you been these past couple of months?
Well, everything is good, relatively. Thanksgiving was weird. The kids didn't come home because of COVID. So it was bizarre. But we got through it, and we're going to get through Christmas. We're going to get through the off season, and hopefully we'll have a baseball season starting on time in 2021. I know that's what I'm rooting for.
Tim, it's got to be a really weird December for you. When's the last time you aren't spending, next week, the second week of December at the winter meetings?
Well, my first one was in 1981, and even though they haven't had the winter meetings every single year, they skipped a few years. I've been at virtually every one since. I did one or two from Bristol when we decided not to travel, but it's weird not being at the winter meeting. It's weird not having a winter meetings, and I'm not sure what to make of this. Like everything else that's happened this year, it's uncharted territory. I will miss the lobby. I also will not miss the lobby with the way the lobby works these days, all the misinformation flowing down there. But it's really exciting time for baseball, and we're going to miss it because it's 4 days where you get to just talk about the game in the middle of December, early December, and we're not going to get that. So I'm not sure it's good for anyone.
Do you know if Scott Boras is planning to hold his annual press conference via Zoom this year? Usually he has everybody gather around, and he's always taking shots at the former Mets ownership, saying they're shopping in the fast food section. But Sandy Ellison has come out and said, we're going for the gourmet food this year. But any word from Scott Boras on how he's going to address this offseason?
Well, I'm sure we'll hear from Scott Boras. I can't tell you, fellas, how many times I've gone to the winter meetings and Scott walks in, and it's like the Beatles are going to play again. Unbelievable, the crowd that he draws. And it just speaks to how powerful he is in this business, how, like it or not, how great an agent he does, how great a job he does. And when he speaks, people listen. So, of course, if he signs one of his key guys, then we'll hear from him. But maybe we'll hear from him even more if nobody signs. If it's not an eventful week on any level, we may hear from him and other agents saying, all right, what's going on here? That's why I'm not really looking forward to this December, because I'm fearful that if we don't have any signings, we're just going to have a bunch of grumblers out there saying, what's wrong here? I think we all know what's wrong. COVID has changed the dynamic again. Owners don't have the money they used to have based on what happened in 2020. And players are still going to say, what about me? As they should. It's their turn. But it could be a very grim, dark winter ahead. Boy, I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, I know last year the offseason kind of moved a little more quickly. The previous 2 years, we were getting people not signed until a week or two before opening day. Most notably, you saw with Bryce Harper there and Manny Machado. But we want to get into the baseball stuff. But first, we had your colleague Doug Kazarian on our show a few weeks ago. And he said, we absolutely had to ask you about the time that you were recognized in a restaurant and what happened after that.
Well, that's a really dumb story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. And it's an Armenian story. Of course, Doug is Armenian like me. So I went to the All-Star game in Seattle, covering it, of course, in 2001. And a waiter at a party came up to me, like shook my hand and said, oh my God, I finally get to meet you. You're Armenian and you're on television, he said, I'm Armenian also. So I talked briefly to this guy, and then another Armenian waiter walks by like 30 seconds later. Knew we had 2 Armenian waiters in the same place in Seattle. So the first waiter introduces the second waiter to me and says, you can't believe who's here. He's on TV and he's Armenian. This is Armenian. So he had a long Armenian guy, but at that point, people were busy. I didn't know what to do, so I just became Armenian for about 45 seconds, and then we all went our separate ways. I didn't know what else to do. It was too embarrassing. Someday those Armenian waiters are going to meet the real Armenian, and they're going to say, this tiny little old guy was pretending to be you in 2001, when that really wasn't the case. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't want to humiliate a fellow Armenian.
Well, that's a fantastic story. I'm glad we asked you.
That's a blast from the past.
Doug actually, we had Doug rank his favorite Armenians, and you were number 1. You blew out the Kardashians. You're the top of his power rankings. He had Matt Vasgersian number 2. So a very strong list there at the top with the Armenians.
Well, I think I'm only number 1 on Doug's list because we're teammates, and because I did the daily wager with him like 20 times, having never placed a bet officially in my entire life at Vegas with a bookie, anything. I bet people at home, I'll bet you $5 that, the Orioles are going to win or whatever, but I've never placed a bet, and I did the daily wager with Doug a bunch of times. So yes, that's where the number 1 ranking comes from. We worked together, and I tried to do his show.
That's a great nugget. You placed a bet before in your entire life. Interesting. Since the last time we had you on, obviously we've gotten through the full season. So I was able to work that out in Secaucus. Everything went over as smoothly as one could hope for. But now we're approaching the off season. So now we could look back at the 2020 season. So among you and other fellow sports writers and personalities, how do you guys think the season went? I thought the postseason was really exciting given the circumstances. Obviously, the playoff format had to change, and I think it was to everybody's benefit this season because I think it was a pretty exciting postseason altogether. So how do you guys think the season ultimately ended up? Obviously, no fans. It was really difficult. And for Nick and myself, us Staten Islanders, we just lost the Staten Island Yankees. Now, granted, they're a low Class A affiliate, but still, that's a really, really hard hit to the economy here. And it's just an example of how COVID has affected the business side. So how do you guys think this season ultimately ended up panning out? And what are your expectations? I know you're optimistic that a lot of things are going to go smoothly heading into the spring, for next season.
Yeah, I think we all have to agree that was the strangest, weirdest, most bizarre baseball season ever. But I'm just thrilled that we finished it because I wasn't sure where you were even going to start it. And then after the Cardinal and Marlin situation, I was really doubtful we were ever going to finish it. And we did. And so that's a huge success for Major League Baseball, even to get 60 games in. And you're right, October was really good. I mean, we played 8 playoff games in one day. I said on the air it was the greatest day of my whole life, 8 playoff games in one day. And I had people actually ask me, Tim, you're married, you have 2 children. How could this be the greatest day of your life? I was kidding. I was just trying to make a point that we had 8 playoff games in one day, and I got to broadcast 2 of them. So it was really great. October, the World Series, despite all its imperfections, was fascinating in its own right. And the fact that we had the best team in baseball, the Dodgers, who were the best team from day one, to the best team at the end, I think kind of legitimized the season a little bit more because the best team won. The Rays belonged in the World Series, and even though they played better, they put up a good fight. Game 4 was one of the craziest things I've ever seen in my life. Anyone has seen a finish to a World Series game quite like Game 4. So in the end, it was the weirdest, stupidest, most awful baseball season ever, and yet it was great because we finished it and we crowned a champion, a very deserving champion.
So I believe the last time we had you on, we were talking about Clayton Kershaw and his playoff demons, right? Now, he already, before entering the 2020 World Series, he had one of the best pitching resumes of all time. And now the question was, okay, you still haven't done it in the postseason. You haven't won a ring yet, right? Which is a little unfair to him because he's had postseason success. Granted, he hasn't had great starts here and there, but he's had success. Now he's got a ring, right? All those questions, I think, are done. I think he's one of those guys who just needs one ring to validate just how exceptional his career is. Where do you think he ranks all time now that you think he's finally, reached the summit, so to speak?
Well, this changes the narrative, and thank goodness for that. I think before this postseason, he was the greatest pitcher to never have won the World Series. I think that was part of the description of Clayton Kershaw. But now that he's won, he's just one of the greatest pitchers of all time. Now, he's not Walter Johnson. He's not Christy Matheson. He's not Pedro Martinez in his prime. He's not Tom Seaver even, but he is right with all of those guys on every level. You look at that career ERA, it's absurdly low. It's historically low in the live ball era. But and when we always compared him to Sandy Koufax had a 0.95 career ERA in the postseason, all in the World Series. So I still think it's a debatable point who's the greatest Dodger pitcher ever. But I think Kershaw has moved into the upper echelon of the greatest pitchers ever. And if you really examine those postseason numbers, they're a whole lot better than they really show. There were a couple of terrible innings that inflated that ERA, but I think this postseason took care of all of that. And thank goodness we don't have to talk about that anymore because that became a tiresome subject.
And maybe perhaps Kershaw was helped by the lack of fans and also pitching at home in Texas. That could have possibly played a role. Unfortunately, this season we lost two all-time great pitchers, Tom Seaver and Bob Gibson. Not to put you on the spot here, but do you have those two pitchers in, let's say, your top 5 of all time as far as pitchers are concerned?
5 is a little high. And again, if I'm going to do this right, we have to go back to, Walter Johnson, Lefty Grove, Grover Cleveland. I mean, we got to go way back if we're going to pick the all-timers. But I've got Gibson and Seaver in the top 15 of all time, and certainly Seaver in the top 10 somewhere. I don't think we remember. I don't think enough people are old enough to remember how great Tom Seaver was. But I remember him vividly from 1969, just how dominant he was and how he carried that Mets team into the playoffs and helped them win the World Series. But I'll also remember that night in Cooperstown about, I would say, 15 years ago, when the night before the Hall of Fame induction, my son, Jeff, who was like 11 at the time, we got into the museum as I was allowed to, and I was allowed to bring my son, and Gus Ramsey, Wally Ramsey, his dad, my dear friends, Tom Seaver, and my son, the 5 of us. Tom Seaver gave us a half an hour and told us the greatest stories ever as we're standing in the Hall of Fame. And it was like one of the most unforgettable nights any of us have ever had. And my son, again, who was 11, and the next day he was going to sleepover camp for the first time. And Tom Seaver said, "Can I go with you, please? I loved that when I was a kid." And he gave my son $100 and said, "Please, let me go with you." That's how playful and how great Tom Seaver was. So when he died, my son called to make sure I remember that story. Of course, I would never forget that story. As far as Bob Gibson goes, also a top 15, and I may be overstating here, but if I had one pitcher to pitch one game in the history of baseball, I would take Bob Gibson. He's the only one that's won 2 Game 7s of the World Series. My wheelhouse as a kid was 1967, 68, watching him pitch against the Cardinals and then against the Red Sox and then against the Tigers. Absolutely breathtaking. and I will never forget how ferocious a competitor he was. Dusty Baker once told me that he asked Hank Aaron, then a teammate, what about Bob Gibson? What should I do with Bob Gibson? Hank Aaron looked at young Dusty Baker and said, whatever you do, don't stare at him. Whatever you do, don't talk to him. And if he hits you with a pitch, whatever you do, don't charge the mound because he will kick your ass. That's what Bob Gibson was. So he and Tom Seaver, two terrible losses in a season of terrible losses for baseball.
Yeah, that's an exceptional story. And I was about to say, we also lost Whitey Ford. We lost Joe Morgan back in October. I believe it was just a couple of days between the both. I think it was 3 days between them both. And we lost Lou Brock too. So it was really, really, really significant year in terms of the guys that we lost in baseball. So, but yeah, exceptional story. One last World Series point we want to make before we move on. Kevin Cash, Blake Snell, Game 6, right? Nothing else needs to be said. Very, very controversial decision. It is within line with the Rays' way of thinking, though. That's how they win baseball games. But from your perspective, right, a lot of people were not thrilled in the moment when that decision was made. But again, this is the way the Rays operate. So what is your opinion on that move? Would you have made it at the time that they did? Would you have given Snell a little more leeway, possibly to go further in the game? Because his ERA does start ballooning after the 5th inning on. That is a big statistical point that people made when the decision was happening.
Right. And I'm well aware of all those numbers, and I'm more than well aware that this is how the Rays got to the World Series operating this way. And, you know, this was not Kevin Cash's call entirely. This was a front office call. This is how front offices all across baseball now operate. And I'm sorry, I'm not on board. That was a mistake. Look, I understand he hasn't thrown more than 6 innings in 2 years. I also understand he's 27 years old. He's 6'4", 225. He won a Cy Young 2 years ago, and he faced 18 batters, gave up 1 hard hit ball, and struck out 9. At some point, even though it's been the plan all year, you have to deviate from the course. You have to veer from the course and say, all right, tonight's different. The best guy on the field that night, the best player on the field that night was Blake Snell, and they took him out after 73 pitches. That doesn't mean that they were going to win the World Series or even win that game if they left him in. But darn it, we have to occasionally let somebody be great. We have to give them the opportunity to shine. We have to let an ace be an ace. We don't do that anymore. People compared this to Grady Little taking Pedro Martinez out in 2003 at Yankee Stadium. Look, I don't agree. I don't think it's the same thing. Grady Little trusted Pedro Martinez maybe too much. He told him, I believe in you. The Rays and so many other teams now look at their own players and say, I don't trust you to get one more out here.
And how about the decision that AJ Hinch pulled Zach Greinke in Game 7 of the World Series last year? I sincerely believe that cost Houston a championship. I think he was unhittable. I think he had gotten Max Scherzer out of the game by that point. And it looked like Washington was demoralized. And then all of a sudden, the Anthony Rendon happens. And all of a sudden, the dominoes start moving. Hinch making moves. And then that was that. Washington came back and won the game. So, you know, we agree with you 100%. You know, it just doesn't happen anymore.
Right. But Dusty Baker left Zach Greinke in this year for a couple more outs. And I stood up and applauded. The veteran manager came out and looked the veteran pitcher right in the eye and said, you're our best pitcher right now. You're going to get these guys out. I trust you. That matters, fellas. This is the most human game there is. And I understand the stats say third time around is not good. But again, once in a while, you have to look into the eye of your own pitcher and say, I'm with you. We're going to get these guys out. Let's go. That would have been the best option that night. Kevin Cash has been killed for that. It's not entirely his fault by any means. And I just hope this is now the tipping point that baseball looks at this and says, are we doing this too much? Are we doing this way too much? Maybe we should give the game back to the players and let them get out of the jam once in a while. Maybe we should leave that guy in for another inning, or maybe we should let that guy hit one more time in this game. Maybe that kind of message is the one we need to send.
So Snell clearly wasn't happy. Do you think that's the last we're going to see of him in a Tampa Bay Rays uniform? Obviously, we've heard he's on the trade block now. Or do you think the Rays, they hold on to him at least till the deadline and wait a little longer like they did with Archer a few years ago?
Yeah, I think it's a legitimate question, but I think the Rays will and should keep Snell on their team. He signed for 3 more years for $39 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but for him, that's not a lot of money in today's day and age. If they trade him, I wouldn't be shocked. If he went to them and said, get me out of here, I need to go to a team where they trust me, I wouldn't be shocked. But I don't think either one of those things is going to happen. The Rays are going to talk to him and say, all right, look, we need you. You're our best pitcher. You know, Tyler Glasnow's still there, but Charlie Morton's gone. They need Blake Snell if they're going to win this division again. They're short on pitching anyway. They can't just trade their best pitcher now, for 3 young prospects and start to rebuild. Not in the Yankees division, not in that American League. So I think they keep him, and I think they should keep him.
So there's 2 things that are really holding up the offseason so far. And the main one is the DH. When do you think we're going to have a decision as to whether or not the DH is going to be universal or not this year? Because you got a lot of guys like Nelson Cruz and now Kyle Schwarber who are non-tendered, and Marcell Ozuna, who a lot of teams in the NL want to know if they should be pursuing these guys or not.
Yeah, it should happen tomorrow, but I don't anticipate it. When you're building a team, you have to know what kind of spots do we have available. And even if it's not a pure DH like Nelson Cruz, you need to know I can go get an extra outfielder now, because 4 outfielders for 3 spots, I have the DH in the National League. It's a perfect situation. But if you don't know, I think that's a mistake for Major League Baseball to last this long without telling everyone what to do. I think it's the best option possible is to keep the DH, universal DH, and announce that it's going to be official as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think that's the first domino that needs to fall. And then the other thing is really the Mets. The Mets are really controlling the whole offseason here, especially with Steve Cohen. And if you're an agent, how do you not check in with the Mets to see if they can get you the most money possible? But before we get into that, we did talk about this guy. I wanted to know your thoughts and if you've heard anything as to when the Mets may finally unveil that Tom Seaver statue at Citi Field.
I don't know the timetable on that, but to repeat, he's not only the greatest Met ever, but there is not a close second. And if people don't understand what Tom Seaver meant to that organization and to that city, especially in his prime, they simply aren't old enough to see it. I am old enough to have recognized it at the time and many years later. So nobody deserves it more than Tom Seaver with what he did for that team.
And of course, Steve Cohen has been very active on Twitter. And one of the main suggestions he got was to bring back Old Timers Day, which the Mets plan to do that at some point. Are there any other Mets that you think that the team will consider retiring their numbers? The Mets haven't really retired too many numbers over the years. Obviously, you have some great players in the 80s. You have Piazza, you have David Wright. Do you think at any point we'll be seeing any other Mets get their numbers retired?
That's a really good question. I guess I could see David Wright's number being retired someday, because for me, certainly one of the 5 greatest Mets ever. But I think you guys have to agree with this. It's really strange how few great position players that the Mets have had in their history. And they've been around since 1962. And after Tom Seaver, it's not obvious who the second greatest Met ever is. Is it David Wright? Is it Mike Piazza? Is it, Keith Hernandez? Is it Darryl Strawberry? Is it Dwight Gooden? It's really odd how the the lack of great position players for the Mets. As you guys know, they've never had an MVP, which is just stunning to believe that after all these years. And I'll have to credit Keith Olbermann with this, and I'm going to be close to this, but we did a game on a couple of years ago, and kind of a Yankees-Mets game comparing the two histories of the two teams, which is just not fair since the Yankees have been around so much longer. But like the 29th all-time home run hitter for the Yankees is Reggie Jackson, and the 29th for the Mets is Wilmer Flores, which is a pretty big difference between the Yankees and the Mets. So I don't think we'll see a Met number retired anytime soon, but those days will come eventually.
Yeah, there is a guy who's making his case for an all-time great Met, and that is Jacob deGrom. If this guy can get another Cy Young Award and get the Mets a World Series, I think he'll be considered one of the best Mets of all time. So obviously, the question here is the Mets have all these finances. Of course, Robinson Cano gives them an extra $24 million by getting busted again, which is an absolute disgrace. And they have a ton of money here. So do you think it's realistic that of the big market guys that are available via trade or free agency, so that's Bauer, Springer, Real Muto, LeMahieu, Lindor, and Arenado, that the Mets could potentially end up with 2, maybe even 3 of those guys?
Yeah, I think it's possible, and I think it's necessary. Steve Cohen has an enormous amount of money, and based on his initial press conference, he's got a really good idea what he wants to do. That was very impressive, and we don't say that very often when an owner steps to the podium like that. But I think, he's wicked smart. I think we all know that. But more important, he has a connection and an investment, and way more than a financial investment, in the Mets. He loves them. He grew up watching them. That's a big difference in the game today since I first started covering late 70s, early 80s. Back then, it was, teams were owned by local guys. It was their team. It was their business. We've gotten so far away from that. And even though Steve Cohen has his other businesses which make gobs of money, I think he looks at the Mets, and when he said, I want to try to win this for the fans, naive me actually believed him. So I think he's going to go out and say, all right, what do we need? All right, they need a catcher. That's obvious. They need a center fielder. To me, that's obvious. And they need another starting pitcher. So I know it's outrageous, but they could sign Trevor Bauer for 1 year. They could sign George Springer for multiple years, and they could sign James McCann, not Real Muto, even though if you get Real Muto, go and get him. If you got McCann to catch, Bauer for just a year, see where it goes, and George going to play center field every day, suddenly the Mets are a really good team.
Yeah, I think if they get another depth piece, that's starting pitcher. I know Kluber is rumored to probably want to stay in the Northeast with his hometown Red Sox, Yankees, or Mets. That's a good depth piece. They have Lugo, which they can move around, and of course, they add some more stuff to people to the bullpen along with Trevor May. They can be in really good shape there. Do you think that anywhere in the back of Steve Cohen's mind, he wants to kind of ease through this offseason, not to ruffle any feathers with the other owners who just voted to approve him, especially considering that next offseason is looking like one of the greatest free agency classes of all time?
Yeah, I see him even through anything. I think he, as a really smart businessman, recognizes now is the time to strike, because I didn't lose any money last year like all these owners did, and it's not my fault that I didn't get approved until the end of 2020. So he should look at it and say, this is business. This is maybe not cutthroat, but this is how you have to do things. Is he appreciative and of the other owners and everything else? Is he respectful? Of course he is. But when you have a chance to get really good overnight with Real Muto, Bauer, Springer, you got to do it. And you can't worry about the feelings of the other owners, especially when you have more money, at least potentially, than like the next 2 to 3 owners combined. You need to take advantage of that. You don't owe it to the other owners. You owe it to your organization and to your fans to do the best job as quickly as possible.
And it seemed that Steve Cohen, he's kind of really surprised that they weren't able to get permission to interview any current GMs to be president of baseball operations. But to me, I think that is kind of smart by a lot of the other teams around the league, because now you're really seeing these front offices built from the ground up. They've developed these guys. And I mean, look at Cleveland, for instance. Obviously, Chernoff, he's from New York, so that seemed like it'd been a great fit. Same with Stearns from Milwaukee. He started out in the Mets system. But is it surprising at all to you that these people are not getting permission to even interview for the Mets front office at this point?
Yeah, I'm a little surprised, but you're absolutely right. The way organizations work now is the front offices are enormous. There are an army of people in there, and there are some really smart people running major league teams these days. And I think this is the other owners saying, look, Steve Cohen has advantages that we don't have right now. We're not going to give him another tool. We're not going to give him more ammunition this season by giving him a really good baseball guy like Mike Chernoff. We're not going to allow that to happen. So that's the interesting part here, and I'm fascinated to see where this ends up. But the good thing is for the Mets, even if they don't get the GM they're looking for, they still have Sandy Alderson, who could do that job anyway. He could use some help. Everyone can use some help in today's day and age. But never forget what Billy Beane told me a long time ago, that whenever he was in trouble as a GM or couldn't figure out what to do, he would always say to himself, what would Sandy do here? What would Sandy do? And that's a real tribute to Sandy Alderson. Smarter than everyone else and a really good feel for how people and the game works.
I'm a little surprised that Sandy hasn't brought back JP Ricciardi or maybe Paul DePodesta from the Cleveland Browns to be his GM. But I think at this point, you're probably looking at Alderson running the show, at least this whole offseason. And then there are rumors, but who knows, sometimes when there's smoke, there isn't fire, that maybe next offseason, after a year off, the Mets try to have a conversation with Theo Epstein and maybe offer him a piece of ownership in order to get him to come on and head up baseball operations. Any truth to that?
That's certainly a possibility. Theo is an exceptionally bright guy, and even though his love for baseball is virtually unmatched, he's got other things that he wants to do in his life, and I really admire him for saying, I need to go do something else for a little while. I need to go clear my head. I need to try something else. And he's going to go do something sensational, no matter what it is. And we might not even hear about it, because that's kind of his MO also. But I think eventually he'll be back in baseball. And I think he'll say, look, won 2 World Series, broke 2 curses. He won't say this, but he's already going to the Hall of Fame as a general manager. He might want to try another avenue, and part owner sounds like something he could really get invested in. I know he wants to make sure that baseball takes a really hard look at how the game is played today, and he might have some input in that, and I think that's a good place for him to start.
Yeah, no doubt about it. He's a Hall of Famer. And just while we're on the Mets, and obviously, you're casting your ballots this time of year for the Hall of Fame anyway, do you see any way that maybe through the Veterans Committee down the road, that Keith Hernandez, who most consider the greatest defensive first baseman of all time, gets into the Hall of Fame?
I think Keith Hernandez is the greatest defensive first baseman of all time. I have never seen a first baseman run the infield quite like he did. I've never seen a first baseman charge a bunt better than he did. I've never seen a first baseman throw the ball across the diamond, first, third on a force, or get a runner going from second to third on a tag play better than Keith Hernandez. To answer your question, anything's open with those veteran committees. I've been on 4 of them, so I know how that dynamic works. It's easier to get 12 out of 16 votes than 75% of the writers. So yes, I think someday there's a chance, but I don't think it's anytime soon. And let's face it, guys, he's going to get hurt by the fact that, a couple of years ago, 58 different guys hit 30 or more homers in a season. The power numbers have changed so dramatically that his power numbers as a first baseman are just not going to add up against a lot of other players. People need to understand, like I already do, he played at a different time when the ball wasn't flying out of the ballpark, when defense was accentuated, and when being a really smart player meant something. So if he were to ever get in, the Hall of Fame would be just as good with him, because he is such a great player, and I so admired watching him do so many little things to help you win a game.
So the Hall of Fame vote announcement is next month, coming up in January on the 26th, right? There are 11 first-timers on the ballot this year. A lot of players are still on the ballot who I believe should be in the Hall of Fame. Guys like Omar Vizquel, who will be a continuing borderline case. I think he's quite possibly the second or third best defensive shortstop in the history of the game. Obviously, Scott Rowland's always a polarizing case. A lot of guys who I still like Jeff Kent, me and Nick. Nick and I, we really like Kurt Schilling, obviously one of your former colleagues, right? So we got 11 first-time guys on the ballot. A lot of guys like Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds have kind of plateaued a little bit when it comes to vote totals. They're approaching, I believe, their 9th year on the ballots. So they're always a topic of conversation. You and Buster Olney and everybody at ESPN and MLB Network and everywhere else are always debating the validity of should these players be in the Hall of Fame? You know, is it fair to make them wait to get in, right? So what is the sense you have among baseball writers this time around? Because I think it's a very, very interesting year. I think for the first time in a while, there's no slam dunk like top guy on the ballot, like either like a Ken Griffey Jr. or a Derek Jeter or Mariano Rivera, where everybody can point to and say, all right, we're voting for this guy. This guy's getting in on the first ballot. That's done. And then we're going to let the chips play out however they may. So what is the sense you're getting with other writers around the country? Are they ready to vote Bonds and Clemens into the Hall of Fame? Are they ready to make a push on certain guys? You know, what could you tell us about that?
Well, I think they're running out of time, and I don't see them making it to the Hall of Fame on the writers' ballot with only 2 more shots at this, and they're in the mid-50s. They got a long way to go. Now, they will be helped, I think this year by the fact that there are no first ballot guys who are just going to, take over. And Kurt Schilling, I think, is going to get in, but maybe this will help Bonds and Clemens' case that the ballot isn't as strong as it's been in other years. And then someone might then say, or more than a few, all right, I'm going to vote for Bonds and Clemens. I've seen a bit of a softening here, but I don't think it's enough of a softening. I still think there is a hardline faction of voters who say, if you have any connection to performance-enhancing drugs, you're not getting my vote. And I think that's where we still will be with Clemens and Bond. I think they'll get a spike this year, but I don't think it's going to be big enough that in their 10th year, the year after this, that they'll make it in.
And next year, of course, the big 2 names that will make their debut on the ballot will be A-Rod and David Ortiz. So it'll be very interesting to see how the votes split there and, differentiate the 2. Tim, are you someone who usually uses all 10 of his votes, or do you just vary based on who's actually on the ballot each year?
Well, I've used 10 votes for many, many years in the past, because I look at the ballot and I see 10 guys who I think are worthy of the Hall of Fame. Now, I don't vote for 10, just vote for 10. I haven't done it every year, but I usually do, because there are years where I'm telling you, fellas, maybe I set the bar a little lower, but I've seen years where there's 17 or 18 guys on the ballot who have a legitimate case to be in the Hall of Fame. We've been through an extraordinary stretch here of great players hitting the ballot at a certain time. And this year, good chance that I'll vote for 10 again. I mean, Scott Rowland I voted for last year, Omar Vizquel, I voted for Jeff Kent, I voted for Kurt Schilling. I would imagine I would vote for 10 this year, but I'm not positive.
So they announced the award about last month, right? And there were still a lot of great performances this year. Obviously, Shane Bieber, Triple Crown. He was amazing for the Indians, right? Every year there seems to be some debate surrounding, who should have won this award, who should have won that award, right? Nick is a huge fan of Jake DeGrom, right? But unfortunately, it was Trevor Bauer this year who took home the NL Cy Young Award. American League MVP, I think it was a little bit of surprise. I think Jose Abreu, the White Sox, came from a place nobody really expected, and he had a really terrific season. Freddie Freeman finally got his due this year. So looking back at the rest of the awards, right, is there any one in particular that stood out to you? Is there any one of the awards that you feel like they got wrong or they feel like they got right, or happy about a certain player who finally got recognition by winning a major award this year?
I think they got them all right. That's the way I see it. The only mild surprise to me was how easily Kevin Cash won as the American League Man of the Year. And he deserved to win it. Don't get me wrong. But, Charlie Montoyo took a team that didn't even have a home ballpark, and they made the playoffs in Toronto. And there were a couple of other really good jobs. I mean, the White Sox made an enormous jump and made the playoffs also. Kevin Cash deserved to win. I didn't think he would win by that much. Everything else, I think we got it right as the baseball writers go. I thought Abreu was the MVP virtually for the last month of the season. Freddie Freeman, there was no doubt in my mind he was. Cy Youngs were no doubt in my mind. I mean, Bauer pulled away with 2.5 weeks to go. Until then, DeGrom was right there. Darvish was right there. And I voted for Bauer first because I had a Cy Young vote in the National League this year. But I didn't think there were many really, really close votes out there, and I think we got them right.
Next year, I want to know, is it a lock that Trey Mancini will be voted the comeback player of the year? Really looking forward to seeing him get back out there for your Orioles.
I certainly hope so. He's such a great kid. He has been through so much, and now he's back hitting again. And, let's hope he's just healthy enough to play next year. I think he will be. And if he's healthy enough to play, he's going to produce because he's a really good hitter, and they really missed him this year. So, that's one of those great stories that keep you coming back. And let's just hope spring training opens on time and Trey Mancini's ready to go when it does.
So, Tim, I have one last question for you before we let you go. So going back to the World Series point with Blake Snell, right? Kind of involved in trade rumors, right? We mentioned this before. Which players do you think their names are not coming up necessarily now, but maybe they're in a situation where their teams are being squeezed, the owners being squeezed maybe by payroll flexibility because of everything that happened during the pandemic? Which players do you think are quietly being shopped, maybe on the move, maybe a guy like Chris Bryant in Chicago because they non-tendered Schwarber? Javier Baez has had his name come up. Epstein is now gone. So it seems like the Cubs are kind of in that rebuilding phase. Maybe like Nolan Arenado in Colorado. Maybe the Rockies are ready to finally hit the reset button. Obviously, his name always seems to come up. And Nick, as a Mets fan, is always talking to me about how maybe the Mets can get a Nolan Arenado or maybe even a Francisco Lindor. It seems like the Indians are kind of reaching a crossroads with him. So who's a guy out there, maybe not even necessarily a big name, who you can kind of see being moved within the next couple of weeks?
Well, you've taken all the good names and you're right on every one of them, and they are fascinating. But I think mostly we have to look at where the Cubs are going to go from here. Theo Epstein's gone. Jed Hoyer's in there. What are the Cubs going to do? Are they going to go into a rebuild mode here? They already non-tendered 2 guys who helped them win the World Series in 2016. Are they going to trade Chris Bryant? I think they are. Are they going to trade Anthony Rizzo? Certainly possible. What are they going to do with Javi Baez, who's a free agent after the 2021 season? They're the team to keep our eyes on because they're in a very competitive division. It wasn't a great division, but 4 teams made the playoffs out of that division. I think they have a lot of work to do, and I think they're going to be the one team to really keep our eyes on as far as rebuilding their club. But the other name, and it's obvious, but it has to be mentioned, is Francisco Lindor. can't see him opening the season with the Indians, knowing that they're just not going to be able to afford him after the season. And he is a great player. And so many teams could be really aided by him. But it's really interesting with the spectacular shortstop class coming up for free agency after 2021. Lindor, Seager, Correa, Baez, Story. Who would want to trade for Lindor knowing I got to give up 3 or 4 players to get him, and then all these other shortstops are going to be free agents after 2021? That makes the Lindor situation absolutely fascinating this offseason.
Do you see any scenario where perhaps the Astros re-sign Springer and then they decide to trade Correa, maybe they move Bregman over to shortstop, and that's the route they go? Or do you think it's pretty much set in stone? They won't be investing in the future with Springer at this point?
Well, in baseball these days, I don't think anything is set in stone anymore. But yes, I think they're going to try to sign Correa long-term, and they're going to let George Springer go. And I'm not even saying that's the right move, because George Springer is a freakish athlete, one of the great kids you'll ever meet. And again, with you guys I'm not just saying this, man, would he look good for the Mets playing center field every day and hitting leadoff or somewhere, hitting ball out of the ballpark, run things down in the outfield, somewhere close to home. I think that would be the perfect move for the Mets. And I think he's going to leave the Astros, and they'll try to re-sign Carlos Correa.
Tim, this was a pleasure. Thank you for being our first 2-time guest. Obviously, wish you happy Thanksgiving, but we also wish you and your family very happy holidays. Merry Christmas, happy Hanukkah to whoever's celebrating. You know how this works. We give you guys the last words. Thanks for coming on. If there's anything else you want to share with us, maybe like a hot rumor or something, the floor is all yours. But thank you for coming on again. And now you came on twice. You're going to have to come on a third time eventually. So, but yes, last words, Tim. Thanks again.
Okay, my pleasure. My last word is going to be corny, but listen, we got to get through this as a country. We got to get people healthy, and then we got to start baseball on time. I'm sorry, as great as 2020 was to finish that season, and all the work that those players did, especially the discipline they showed to get it in, no one wants to go through a season like that again. That was not fun for the most part. It was exhausting for so many people. So let's get healthy. Let's get a vaccine. Let's start on time. And I think the only way to do that is we're going to have to really be smart from here.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. Tim, thank you so much. So for our very special guest, Tim Kurkjian, and for my co-host, Joe Calabrese, I'm Nick Durst, and this has been You Know